Welcome to First Canada's FTC Sim tutorials. This series is about how to use FTC Sim, a First Tech Challenge robot simulator created by First Canada. Today, we're going to talk about loops. But before we do, a couple of things. Number one, if you do not have an account for FTC Sim, you can go right here to firstroboticscanada.org/FTC Sim. And on this page, you'll see there's a place where you can create your account, and it's free. So please sign up. And then when we go to our FTC Sim and choose one of the challenges, you can join us and keep up to pace with us. Anyways, the other thing, I said there were two things. The other thing I wanted to mention is, did you know? So, did you know that this guy here, except for the long hair in the back, we look kind of similar actually, now that I look at him, is James Gosling. And James Gosling is the creator of Java. And Java is a hugely, hugely popular program and has been for many years. And James is a Canadian. And he's actually from Calgary, although I believe he has been most recently living in California, where all of these great new inventions and new languages and new startups are coming from. But the reason I mentioned James is that the language that's used to code in FTC is actually Java. Even in the blocks environment, it's Java. If you were to go into FTC to do some of the blocks coding, you can see when you put in the blocks, automatically on the right hand side there's a window that appears that converts it to actual Java. Then you can learn as you go along. So hopefully you knew that. If you didn't, you do now. Anyways, one of the big things that all programming languages can do is they can have loops. And essentially what loops are a way to repeat lines of code that you keep using again and again and again in a single program. And there are, as you can see, several ways to do that. We see a loop every single time we've done one of these, and it's this repeat while loop. But the repeat while loop actually has a little arrow that comes down because you can say repeat until. So what's the difference? Well, repeat while is going to repeat whatever the lines of code in here. Right now there's just a comment. The computer ignores comments or remarks, as they're also called, and doesn't do anything with it. But we could have code in there. We could have lots of code in there, as a matter of fact, and we have in some of the programs that we've done already. And if you've done some, you've probably done that as well. Anyways, this one says repeat whatever the code might happen to be here while the simulator is still active, which means that I haven't clicked on go, and then when I click on reset, now I've stopped the program, and that would cause this to stop. One of the things that I'm going to mention that you need to be aware of, because I've made this mistake many, many times, is that sometimes you need to break out of your loop or else the loop will keep going. We call that an infinite loop. You put something in there and it will never stop. This one will, of course, stop because it's got the reset there. But just be aware of that often you want to break out of the loop. Sometimes you want to pause the loop, and there's a second option here. And it's continue with the next iteration of the loop, which means go back to the beginning of the loop and start again, and keep continuing with that loop. I just mentioned that because sometimes you may want to use this as a debugging technique to have it pause so that you can see what's going on and so forth. So anyways, that's a couple things to know. But what I want to do is I want to mention some of these things. So just again, repeat until means you're going to do something until this line is true. And repeat while means you're going to do something, the code inside the loop, while this line is true. And you can have different lines here. You can have a calculation, you can have a comparison, and so forth. This one up here is, so these kind of loops where you have while and until, they're often called conditional loops because there's a condition and the condition's right here. As long as that condition is true, something's going to happen. In this particular one, this loop is often also called a counted loop. And what it means is that it's going to use something called a counter. Now, as soon as I put this in here, and if I was to put it inside my program, it means that whatever is inside the code here is going to repeat. It's going to do it 10 times, one after another, unless, of course, I have something that breaks me out of there. I might have an if, I might have in there, I might have an if, and there's a condition in this if, and what happens in the if is that if that condition is true, then it takes me out of the loop. So, for example, if I'm running my robot and I have a loop here and I want to do something 10 times, but I check my distance sensor and I find out that I'm like just a fraction of an inch from or a centimeter from the wall, I might want to break out of that loop if that loop is keeping me moving forward. So that's just something to keep in mind. And of course, you could have a different number in there. You could have 5, you could have 6, you could have a huge number. The next one, we looked at the while. The next one is this a counted loop. Now, I should mention that we talked about variables before, and technically this is a variable. So if we looked at variables now, we would see that i's in there. Okay. Now I created a different variable at one point, and before I started this one, and I called it count. So I'm going to just put there. That's another variable. Typically, we would want to write variables like this. Often, if we're using another kind of a counted loop, this is one kind, this is another kind. If we're using that, we'll often use I, or sometimes you'll see people use A, but they'll try to use the same one all the time, just because it's easier for them when they go through it. Oh, what does that letter mean? In this case, it says, oh, I'm going to start counting from 1 and going to 10. So meaning that it's going to go through this loop that many times, starting at 1. I could go from, say, -1 or -5, and I can go up by a different number than 1. I could go up by 2. I could go 1 to 100, and so on. So there's lots of options. Typically, we're doing something like that where we're using a lot of numbers to do something. We might be trying to do some calculations, and that's typically not what we're doing here in this, but it is available. The one thing that's also available is I can actually count down, and I can go from 10 to 1, and I can go, I would have to say, okay, I want to go down by -1. I want to go down by -1 each time. So there's another kind of loop. And the last of the loops that we have here is this one where it talks about a list. Now, a list, you can see there's a whole category for lists. A list is essentially, in computer terms, it's often referred to as an array, but you will hear list used a lot. And obviously, he didn't want to use, or she didn't want to use I here and then I here, so they put them down different ones because I dragged them both in, and they both appear here. So now it wouldn't make sense to have them both called the same thing necessarily. And in this particular case, you might have a huge list of names, and you're searching for one, so you're going to check each name in that list and do something based on when you find that name, or maybe you're going to do something in every name. It's not as easy to demonstrate these things in FTC Sim because the running a robot doesn't sort of invite itself to using that kind of stuff, but it's a important thing to know. And as you go along through this stuff, I think you'll find some uses for it. But right now, the two most common loops that we would use is the while loop and the loop until. So just so you're aware of some of your options. But these sorts of loops, conditional loops like these ones, counted loops like these ones here, are available in pretty much every language. They're done a little bit differently in some of them, but they are in pretty much every language that you would see. So hopefully you learned a little bit, both about James Gosling and Java and about FTC Sim, and most particularly today about loops, and that we'll see you back next time. If you get a chance to try this out on some program, try it out. In any case, we'll be back again with another new tutorial shortly. So please join us at FTC Sim, and if you do have any questions, please feel free to contact me at pkeenan@firstinspires.org.